Welcome to another episode of Beyond the Basics, a reference guide for mathematics. This is episode 8, multiplying positive and negative numbers. We're going to start by discussing what it means to multiply. Then we're going to look at multiplying on a number line, and then multiplying by groups, and we're going to look at the rules of multiplying and ways to help you remember them. What is multiplication but repeated adding? Adding the same number over and over again. So 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3 over and over again. Multiple times. That's where the term times come from, like 3 times 4 is because 3 happens 4 times or multiple times. So this is looking at multiplication as repeated groups. Repeatedly adding positive numbers where we're going to start, because we're going to start from a place you already know. 3 times 2 is 6. Why? Because you have 3 groups of 2. Why? Because on the number line, when you see 3 groups of 2 stacked on top of each other, you get 6. That's why. You can also reverse it and look at 2 times 3 being 6. So you have 2 groups of 3. 2 groups of 3 is still 6. So either 3 groups of 2 is 6 or 2 groups of 3 is 6. That's what repeatedly adding is. That's what multiplication is. What if you repeatedly add negative numbers? Like 2 times negative 3. I have down that it's going to be negative 6, but why? Because 2 groups of negative 3 is what you're adding. And if you stack them together, they go down to negative 6 because they're negative numbers. If I switch it and have 3 times negative 2, it's still negative 6, because now you have 3 groups of negative 2. Negative 2 plus negative 2 plus negative 2 is negative 6. What if you have negative first? Like this. Negative 3 times 2. I still have it down as negative 6, but why is it negative 6? Well, it means negative 3 groups of 2, but what's a negative group? What about this one? Negative 2 times 3 equaling negative 6. I still have that one as negative 6 also. So we have negative 2 groups of 3 this time. But again, what are negative groups? Well, I could explain negative groups, and I will explain negative groups eventually. It's a little bit more complex in this particular model with the number line. So I want you to consider that multiplication is commutative, meaning that you can reverse it and get the same answer. So just like on the slide previous, 3 times 2 was 6, but 2 times 3 was 6. That's true for all multiplication, even with negative numbers. So if we commute negative 3 times 2, we get 2 times negative 3, and that's still negative 6, just as the dot shows you. And if we reverse or we commute negative 2 times positive 3, then we have positive 3 times negative 2. Watch the dot again. 1, 2, 3 groups of 2. You still landed at negative 6. So you can use the commutative property to understand that when you have one negative factor, your answer is going to be negative. So what if they're both negative? I always get that. When you teach middle school, they do that a lot. So what's the opposite of that? Like negative 2 times negative 3, you mean? Why, that's positive 6. Why, you ask? That's always a good question. Asking why is not a bad thing. That means you have negative 2 groups of negative 3. But again, what's a negative group? Well, negative means the opposite of something. So if you've ever seen a negative on a photograph, like the negatives when you had film, and you held them up to the light and the colors were weird, the colors were the opposite color on the color wheel. So your reds would be greens, your blues would be orange, and your purples would be yellow, and your blacks are whites, and so on and so forth, blended in. Negative means the opposite. So we're going to look at it as the opposite of 2 groups of negative 3. Well, we already know that 2 groups of negative 3 is negative 6. Thus, the opposite of it would be positive 6. So negative 2 times negative 3 is the opposite of 2 groups of negative 3, so it's positive 6. Looking at the last one there too, negative 3 times negative 2, also positive 6. because those same negative groups are still the opposite of -3 groups, or the opposite of 3 groups of -2. And we already saw that 3 groups of -2 is -6. The opposite of that is +6. Let's write this down in our notebooks before we move on. Pause as you need to. So I didn't do the negative times a negative in our number line notes. We'll get to that later on in the notes. So the title is Rational Numbers, Integers, and we are multiplying. To multiply means repeated adding. And there are 2 of our examples. Our positive example, 3 times 2, meaning 3 groups of 2. So you have 2 plus 2 plus 2, which is 6, and then I showed 2 plus 2 plus 2 on the number line. That's the first example, so I boxed it in green. And then 3 times -2 is -2 plus -2 plus -2, which is -6, and I showed that on the number line. Here's what my notes look like finished. You can add color and designs as you like to make your pages happy. Or if you like them plain and clean, you can do that as well because it's your notebook. Writing in your notebook is to help you remember things. And writing things down, just the act of writing it down, is a great memory tool. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.